Introduction, Renaissance Siena, The State of Research by Jenkens Lawrence. In a Lawrence Jenkens edition, Renaissance Siena Art in Context, Kirsville, Missouri, Truman State University Press, 2005. Did Siena have a Renaissance? As recently as 1994, a historian of late medieval Siena wrote about the city in the 15th century. All sectors of Sienese life reflected this economic lethargy, including urban planning. Again, no changes or noteworthy additions to the architectural fabric of the city are to be found. The urban restructuring of that characterized numerous other contemporary Italian cities had no significant impact upon Siena. Although Duccio Ballustracci is here referring to urban planning in a particular, his remarks reflect a broad consensus that has governed historical attitudes towards the Sienese Renaissance, at least until the last 20 years or so. Indeed, many scholars assert that Siena had no true Renaissance, even when they speak of Renaissance Siena. And this is especially true when they equate that period with the artistic and architectural styles that developed in 15th century Florence. This volume will argue on behalf of a Renaissance in Siena, first by restating the definition of a Renaissance, and then by looking at specific works of art or architectural commissions and understanding them not only as pale reflections of Florentine ideas and styles, but also within the political, social, economic, and cultural context of Siena itself. The following essays will address this latter task, which is often more daunting than one might suppose. This introduction will consider what it means to talk about Renaissance in Siena, and if indeed Siena had a Renaissance, as it seems it did, then it becomes important to construct a framework for the issues that define the work of scholars interested in that city in the 15th and 16th centuries. What follows, then, is not so much an exhaustive review of the literature on Renaissance Siena, but a consideration of the state of research in this area of Italian 15th and 16th century studies. It is important to situate the book within the field in many ways. It both reflects current scholarly trends and points the way to the future. Interest in Siena during the Renaissance, a period most often defined as stretching from about 1400 to the city's incorporation into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in 1555, has blossomed in recent years. This seems to be part of a more of a general trend in Italian Renaissance studies to look beyond the center, Florence in the 15th century, and Rome and Venice in the 16th, to the periphery, the smaller cities and towns that fill the map of Italy between the principal cities. The notion of periphery is, however, more than geographical. It extends to the arena of the ideas and art, thus the cultural production of cities like Siena has been judged by the degree to which it successfully emulated the models produced at the center. The more it differed from that model, the less value it had. As a consequence, the cultural production of peripheral cities has often been passed over, or at best treated summarily in the context of Roman studies. The study of Siena in the 15th and 16th century has been further discouraged by the great attention focused on the city's late medieval period. The last decade of the 13th century and the first half of the next century represent Siena's golden age. Under the government of the Nove 1287 to 1355, the city enjoyed an unprecedented political stability and economic prosperity, and its merchant bankers were players one cannot on not just a regional but also an international stage. As Siena flourished, its government worked to refashion the city's fabric and thus its identity. Siena's cathedral was given a magnificent new facade, and the city fathers dreamed of expanding the building to make it one of the largest churches in Italy. The shell of the Duomo Nuovo and its unfinished facade still stand adjacent to the cathedral. At the same time, the seat of government, the Palazzo Pubblico, rose quickly on the Piazza del Campo, Siena's central square. Its three light Gothic windows provided the legislated model for the windows in all the palaces facing the piazza in an attempt to create a harmonious whole at the heart of the city's political life. Extraordinary achievements in the figural arts also defined the Sienese Gothic period, when Duccio di Bognosegna, monumental altarpiece for the Duomo, his superb Maestà, was founded in 1311. It was taken to the cathedral in a public procession. The Virgin and Child enthroned reaffirmed Siena's special relationship with the Mother of God, and her role as the city's queen and the protector was reiterated in the political sphere by Simone Martini's frescoed Maestà. In the council chamber in the Palazzo Pubblico, the inscription on Martini's work represents the Virgin's own exhortation to the members of the government to rule her city wisely in her place. The benefits of wise governance, as well as the dangers of a bad regime, are most famously represented in Ambrogio Lorenzetti's frescoed allegory of good and bad government. In the chamber of the nerve center, as it were, of the city's government, indeed, Lorenzetti's paintings have come to represent a visual summa of the philosophy of Italian Republican in the latter part of the Middle Ages. The cultural greatness of Siena in the first half of the 14th century and city's failure to produce works of art in the Florentine mode in the following century have resulted in the idea that the city and its patrons were conservative, holding onto the visible vestiges of the past, as if in doing so they could in some way recreate the stability and prosperity of a bygone time. For example, in Judith Hook's popular history of Siena, still the layperson's best introduction to the city's history and culture, she confronts the conservatism of Sienese art in the Renaissance, giving voice to the traditional concern over the conscious rejection of the Florentine manner by Sienese artists who instead seemed willing to embrace the Gothic. It was inevitable that Sienese artists, and for that matter, Sienese patrons, should be responsive to and influenced by not only their Florentine and Umbrian contemporaries, but also their own great artists whose works they had always before their eyes. It was clearly difficult for the Sienese artist to escape from traditional styles, and indeed doubtful that he ever wanted to, largely because the Sienese did think with their eyes. They issued the radical which the Florentines positively welcomed. It was which gave to Sienese culture a sense of continuity, of a single development pursued by a whole community, and it was for this reason that Sienese humanism remained largely academic exercise, whereas in Florence it found practical application in painting, sculpture, and architecture. Stated within its traditional parameters, then, The problem in Siena during the Renaissance is of a culture mired in its own past and therefore only partially receptive to contemporary ideas, be they in the visual arts or elsewhere. And while one might debate the reasons for this situation, the end result has always been clear. A flower of the late Middle Ages, Siena's bloom faded in the 15th century, and its rootstock was never again strong enough to compete with the Renaissance as it blossomed first in Florence and then in Rome. The foundation of this argument is the preferential status given by historians to Florentine culture from the beginning of the 15th century. The earliest historians of Italian art, and especially Giorgio Vasari, who came from central Italy, suggest that the city enjoyed a sort of cultural hegemony. The city's predominance in 15th century Italy was in many ways made implicit by Jacob Burckhardt, the great 19th century historian and father of Italian Renaissance studies. Yet, this was not so clearly the case in the 1400s. Florence enjoyed a position of economic prominence in Italy in the late medieval period, but politically, it was only one of many players on the Italian peninsula, and not always the most important. Florentine artistic output in the 15th century was impressive and influential, but it was unlikely that artists who worked elsewhere. Gentile da Fabriano or Antonio Pizzanola, in North Italy, and Vecchia and Jacopo della Quattro in Siena, to name but a few, believed that their style was out of date, or that they were reflecting a more perfect mode of expression that was developing in Florence. It seems to be a historical hindsight that identifies the work of artists like Donatello and Masaccio as the true path to the High Renaissance. Vasari's modern manner, including the work of Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo, a grand tradition that would dominate Western art until the end of the 19th century. Using this standard to judge the art of Siena or any other Italian city, one finds what appears to be a pale of reflection of modernity, an art that stubbornly resisted contemporary trends to bury itself in a past more glorious than its present could hope to be. By understanding the artists in Siena during the Renaissance were part of a dynamic dialogue that was shaped by the needs and circumstances of the time. Then the art of Siena's golden age and the Florentine Renaissance became but possible styles to draw upon rather than an absolute standard by which to judge later works. If the terms Renaissance, literally the rebirth of classical civilization, was originally associated strongly, if not exclusively, with a post-medieval Florentine culture, in more recent times it has become a catch-all phrase to describe the whole of Italy and much of the rest of Europe during the period between the Middle Ages and the modern era. The word now denotes a broad chronological period across a wide geographical area, but often means little more than that. What then does it mean to talk about Renaissance in Siena? The answer is difficult and disagreement. It is likely among scholars who work on Renaissance Siena, in order to place the essays in this volume in context, the 15th and much of the 16th centuries in Siena can be described as experiencing a Renaissance in the sense of the city, like so many others in Italy, underwent important cultural changes, fueled at least in part by a revival of classical learning. The patterns of change are not exactly like those that took place in Florence, although the reception of a Florentine style certainly influenced the Sienese artists during the Renaissance. Perhaps then this period in Siena was shaped not so much by whether its artist understood and could reproduce the better mode of Florentine art, but rather by when Sienese artists became attracted to Florentine art and why their work did not exactly look like that model. Historically, historiography of Renaissance Siena. Historians have long been interested in Siena, although their attention has focused traditionally on the late medieval rather than the Renaissance period. This interest has yielded many important studies that elucidate the city's social and political structure, its institutions of government, and its economic underpinnings. The issues of what Siena looked like, how it grew, and how its public buildings were decorated during the Gothic period have also received important attention. Millard Mice's painting in Florence and Siena after the Black Death and Nikolai Rubinstein's political ideas in Sienese art, for example, are landmark studies in the relationship among the arts, the affairs of state, and the social context of both. The history of Renaissance Siena has recently begun to receive more attention, both from Italian and international scholars. The problem, at least at first, was to overcome the long-standing sense that the city's history after the 14th century was one of decline and thus less interesting than its golden age. Ferdinand Schivel phrased this prejudice most eloquently in the short chapter on the twilight of Siena. In his 1909 Siena, the story of a medieval commune. The medieval commune, the history of which I set out to trace, perished with the spread of the new civilization, bearing the name of the Renaissance in formal sense. Indeed, the Republic of Siena lived far into the new period, but it led to a maimed existence at the mercy of circumstance, and without that splendid vigor which distinguished it in those strictly medieval centuries. It was precisely because the town in its creative period exhibited an irrepressible activity and developed an attractive and original civilization that we of another age are content to follow its fortunes and to linger over its works. For the same reason, the age of the Renaissance, a period of unarrested decline, has but a weak claim on our interest. Still, whoever has followed with sympathy the rise of the culmination of this original and perplexing people will not rest until he has given himself the melancholy satisfaction of viewing also the end. Like Hook, Cheval, writing as recently as a 1979, although with less sympathy, sees the Quattrocento in Siena through the filter of the age of the Renaissance. That is Florence, and in comparison, it simply has not commanded the historian's attention. The situation has changed over the last 2 decades, and the history of Renaissance Siena has enjoyed more through and more thoughtful attention. The shadow of Cheval's judgment, but one example of a point of view more generally held, is a long one. Mario Asarci addressed it in his introduction to the Italian translation of the catalogue of the Metropolitan Museum's painting in Renaissance Siena, 1420 to 1450. 1420 to 1500. Sorry about that. A shadow hangs over Siena, he wrote, and one made darker by a comparison with contemporary and preeminent Florence. The comparison could not have been more deceptive. Siena appeared still today always to be behind, always in crisis. For Asarci, however, the study of the Quattrocento is further plagued by a sense of knowledge by the ending when the city fell in 1555, it was a victim not only of international politics and jockeying for power on the late Italian peninsula between the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, but also of its own internal strife. Indeed, of the theme of civil discord, marks of the history of Renaissance Siena, and a number of its prominent citizens from the late Trecento through the Renaissance, from Saints Catherine and Bernardino to Pope Pius II and his nephew, Cardinal Francesco Piccolomini, all noted it was exhorted to the city to seek political harmony. Thus, the 15th century had it become, one again, as Asari notes, the incubulum of the final crisis after the splendors of the 13th and 14th century. The problem then for contemporary historians, and the same is certainly true for art historians, is to see the Renaissance in Siena for itself, and not as either an echo of its own past or a harbinger of the disastrous end of the Republic, and thus of Sienese culture. The fundamental concern of recent historians then has been to understand the political culture of Siena during the 15th century. The period is marked by factional discord within the city, strife that is manifested in the shifting balance of power among the Monti, the traditional political parties, not parties in the modern sense of the word, but rather political factions into which one was born and between which one rarely moved throughout this century, and especially in its last 2 decades. Not surprisingly, the literature reflects this interest. A review of what has been published over the last 20 years or so highlights an intense attempt to understand the phenomena of government by Monti and the instability it brought. It also points to a fundamental problem in the histography of Renaissance Siena. A student of the Renaissance approaching a Sienese topic must be struck immediately by the paucity of published work on the city in this period, especially compared to the literature on Renaissance Florence. This is particularly true for subjects outside the political realm, and in this sense, the same is true of the late medieval period. The reasons for the lies, in part, in the relative newness of the field, but it can also be explained by the documents that are available for the interested historian. Florence certainly holds a privileged position in the field of the early Renaissance studies, but it also proved a fertile field for scholars from many disciplines because of the rich source material that survives in the city's various archives. The Florentines left behind not just political and institutional records, but also in the recondons and zibaldoni evidence of their business doings, their religious activities, and their neighborhood and family relationships. Documents from governmental bodies, convents, and confraternities abound, as do personal letters and journals, private ledgers, and other materials that allow both for an understanding of political and institutional structures and a glimpse at the everyday lives of at least a segment of the city's population. These materials have given rise to the extraordinary studies of the social and culture history of the city. The same is not true in Siena. The deliberations and correspondence of political bodies and the account books of institutions survive, as do a fair number of notarial notebooks. The result, however, is a rather official legalistic picture of Siena in both the late medieval and Renaissance periods. There are deliberations of various councils and instructions to embassies, transcripts of some judicial proceedings, and records of sales, transactions, petitions, taxes, and testaments. Many of the works of Sienese humanists and chroniclers have also survived. It is the more intimate documents that are missing. There are very few letters or diaries or even personal account books to illuminate the daily activities or concerns of individuals or families. One may wonder whether the Sienese wrote letters to one another. In fact, they did not. They did, but perhaps they were not overly concerned with preserving them. In any case, there are many aspects of life in Renaissance Siena that are very difficult to penetrate or simply elusive. Thus, the literature on the Renaissance in Siena is largely concerned with the turbulent political situation in the city and tends to focus on moments of crisis. The tyranny of the Visconti Dukes of Milan at the very beginning of the 15th century, the conspiracy of 1456, the political demands of Pope Pius II, perhaps Siena's most famous son in the Quattrocento, and especially the chaos of the Monti that began in 1480 and ended, at least temporarily, with the rise of the Pandolfo Petruccia and his heirs, who governed Siena until 1525. There is also considerable interest in the demise of the Republic at the end of the War of Siena in 1555, although until recently that event was treated largely as if it were detached from the rest of the city's history. It appears, however, that the bulk of recently published materials focuses on events in the second half of the 15th century. Beginning with Antonio di Cecco, Petruccia's conspiracy in 1456, which led to a reformulation of the division of power among the three Monti, the Nove of the Popolari, and the Reformatori who had governed the city in a relative harmony since Visconti were expelled in 1403. The vast majority of this literature is in the form of articles that most often deal with a rather specific issue or moment. Nonetheless, at least a broad picture of the political situation in the latter part of the Quattrocento and the early Sequecento has begun to emerge, and it is worth summarizing here. Most historians of the Renaissance in Siena seem to accept that beginning in the 15th century, the traditional organs of government, the two councils of the Consistero or Senate and the larger Consiglio General, had been deprived of much of their statutory authority, and that real power came to be focused in the hands of the Balia. Originally an extraordinary committee formed to deal with the punishing rebellious citizens, that Balia is usually thought to have become permanent institution in the 1450s and then to have developed into the central and quasi-absolute power in Siena. Command of the Balia was thus tantamount to control of the city, despite the fact that the traditional institutions of government survived well into the 16th century. The political crisis that came to a head in the 1480s and 90s has therefore been defined as a continuous struggle between political factions to dominate a more or less prominent Balia. Going further, Asari has suggested that these fundamental institutions of government were changing, so were the boundaries that defined social status and political class. He argues that the breakdown of the political system at the end of the 15th century was due in large part to the growing number of families from all the Monti who considered themselves to be members of a redefined nobility. According to the hypothesis, the trend toward an enlargement of the aristocratic class contributed both to the disintegration of the traditional Monti and to the traditional Monte and to an increasingly rigid line between classes, a distinction still made through more or less on the basis of political affiliation that favored an oligarchical form of government over a republicanism. For Azarchi, then, these changes in the city's social structure made Petrucci's rise to power as tyrant of Siena, but all but inevitable. A.K. Isaacs, writing about the political or about the period from 1480 to 1487, and Christine Shaw, dealing more generally with the last 2 decades of the Quattrocento, have each recently suggested a somewhat different and more fluid scenario. For both scholars of this period was one of experimentation. Isaacs argues that in the late 1480, the demise of the republicanism was by no means a certain thing. Indeed, she should suggest that the Sienese themselves would not have made a distinction in their political travails between republicanism and seigneurial government, but rather between the Balia and the councils. That is, between a system that sought to restrict power to a few families and one prededicated on a much more expansive view of who should participate in the political debate. The 1480s marked a period when these systems existed side by side, and the turmoil of these years was a symptom of the process of experimentation that included both of them. Shaw's analysis of the last 20 years of the Quattrocento, which demonstrates that Bali were not institutionalized until the 1480s, and even then restricted to their own powers, leads her to a similar conclusion. The 1480s and 1490s were characterized by repeated attempts to define and settle the balance of power, not just between the Monti, but also between the Balia and the Consiglio and the Consigna. Del Popolo, between the political elite and the popolo. The period that encompasses both Pandolfo Petruccio's ascent to power in 1497 and his rule, which lasted until he died in 1512, is as difficult to understand as the turbulent years that preceded it. By the end of the 15th century, the Bali did indeed control the city. David Hicks has characterized the Bali elected in November 1497 as Petruccio's, and its appointment as a confirmation of his role as the city's first citizen. Yet, although Petruccio may well have been the driving force behind the Balia, its position was by no means entirely secure. The Consiglio del Popolo had several times rejected the proposal for the new Balia before barely passing it with the required majority on 21st of November. Elected for a 5-year term, the Balia then set out to reform the Regimento by reducing the number of individuals, many of them members of the old Monte de Reformity, now incorporated into the Gentilemania, eligible to serve in the Consiglio del Popolo in the future. The full impact of this reform still debated, but there seems to be no question that it narrowed the Regimento and by default Petruccio's ascendancy over it. If Siena's problems lay largely in its history of factional fighting, to cast Petruccio as a modern compromise between extremist elements, the Monte di Nove, which advocated the exclusion of all menti but their own from Regimento and the del Popolo, which had sought broader representation in the government, is not entirely accurate, nor does it do justice to Petruccio's own ambition. The failed plot to overthrow Petruccio in September 1498, spearheaded by his father-in-law, Niccolo Borghese, indicates that there was some apprehension concerning Petruccio's growing power. In his article on his aborted coup, Giuseppe Chirono suggests that Borghese, far from a radical novisco, sought to protect the existing order from Petruccio's seigneurial ambition for the benefit of the city's families. Although the conspiracy involved mostly members of the Nove, it is also included Andrea Piccolommo and Girolamo Tolomei among the most important members, respectively, of the Monte del Popolo and the Gentissimo, and its rallying cry was Viva il presente Regimento e Fiora ci occupa il bien comune. Petruccio's authority was threatened more seriously when, on 28 January 1503, and at the insistence of Caesar Borgia, he was sent out of Siena and into exile. Authority remained in the hands of the Balia, and Andrea Piccolommo, Leonardo Belmonte, and Angela Palmieri emerged as pivotal figures in the regime. On 30th of January, with Andrea Piccolomini as prior for the day, the Balia officially declared Petruccio an exile, but declared not that neither his family nor his property were to be prejudiced by this. In the end, Petruccio was allowed to return to Siena, this time at the instance of Louis XII of France, who was eager to exclude Siena from Caesar Borgia's growing sphere of influence. As a result of Shaw's protege research, much of has been learned about the events of 1498 and 1503. However, this research also points to a fundamental lacuna in the understanding of these and other important moments in the history of Renaissance Siena. Little is known, for example, about the obviously key figure of the Andrea Piccolomini or any of the others who stood or against Pandolfo Petruccio during his rise to power and his rule over Siena, or about their interest in supporting or opposing him. There is, in other words, something of a vacuum around the major figures and events, and thus much about them remains largely in the realm of political facts, whose interpretation is not yet nuanced by the wider context in which they occurred. Much progress has certainly been made in the last 2 decades, and much more is known about the city's political infrastructure. Throughout the Renaissance period, that said, the facts are obviously crucial, and the situation at present serves most to show how much work there is yet to be done. A myriad of publications in the last several years demonstrates that work on the history of Renaissance Siena continues at a rapid pace. Much of this work is still based exclusively on archival sources. Many articles have brought single documents to light in order to illuminate the broader issues of interest to the individual scholar. Although these issues often remain almost by necessity ill-defined, there seems to be little overarching purpose in Siena's research. This too must be the result of publishing research in articles rather than books, where longer and more synthetic studies could present broader goals and a more nuanced view of the subject matter. Thus Shaw's study of the ascendancy Pandolfo Petruccio hopes to find relevance not only in the history of Siena but also in the history of Italy, as one of the last examples of a citizen who sought to make himself Signor of a republic. In the politics of exile in Renaissance Italy, her detailed studies of Sienese exiles in the 15th and early 16th centuries. She also sheds light on what was a pan-peninsular political remedy in this period, in the same sense but on a grander scale, and with something of a methodological agenda. I'm sorry. Methodological agenda. My eyes just. I'm so sorry, guys. Samuel Cohn's death and property in Siena, 1205 to 1800. One of the few social histories of Siena in any period also tackles a broader subject matter, attempting to afford glimpses of family life, of individual beliefs and actions, about property, and about the soul. Finally, Maurizio Gaetano at De Camogli's study of Petruccio's foreign policy also places the action of individual man and his government into the larger context of Italian affairs at the time, and reveals that Petruccio and Siena, like other small states, were as much the pawns of larger interest as they were the masters of their own destiny. In her introduction to a collection of essays on the fall of Siena, a republic, likely the most studied moment in the history of Siena after the Middle Ages, Isaac offers what is perhaps the truest and most fundamental decision of the Sienese historian's task and purpose. Regardless of the period he or she chooses, referring to the War of Siena and the city's subsequent incorporation into Grand Duchy of Tuscany, she writes, "This dramatic event has been the subject of a long tradition of scholarly inquiry. Nonetheless, the War of Siena has not, as a historical topic, been exhausted. This is true because an understanding of the war requires the study of unpublished archival sources scattered across much of Europe, as well as those also preserved in private archives. But it is also true, and more importantly perhaps, because it has been interpreted in either a celebratory or ideological light. This latter circumstance has made it difficult to investigate the manner in which the war and its issues were understood in the 16th century. 16th century, and even more problematic to probe the deeper motivation of those who were involved in it. The historiography of art in Renaissance Siena. A series of large shows, one mounted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in the winter of 1988 and through 89, and the others in Siena in 1990 and 1993, dedicated to the arts in Renaissance Siena, are as symptomatic of a strong and sustained renaissance of interest that blossomed about 15 years ago, mounted in honor of Sir John Hope Hennessy on his 75th birthday. The New York exhibition painting in Sienese Renaissance Siena, 1420 to 1500, enjoyed real success among the museum-going public and brought a large body of works by Sienese artists back to the attention of Renaissance art historians. A mammoth exhibition dedicated to the Domenico Beccafumi and his times followed shortly thereafter in Siena. The 1993 show was dedicated to Francesco di Giorgio as painter, sculptor, and architect. Although each exhibition had its own agenda, as a group of they served to focus attention not just on the leading artists of the 15th century and early 16th century, but also on Siena's cultural milieu during this period. These shows put Siena back on the map of Renaissance Italy. One might also expect that they are responsible for the recent flurry of research into the artists and culture of the city among the specialists. Interestingly, however, it seems that while these exhibitions have certainly attracted attention to Siena and the city's rich cultural production during the Renaissance, they have not come to serve as the foundations for current research on Sienese art. The reason for this are largely logistical and methodological. Francesco di Giorgio, for example, remains a figure of immense interest at the end of the Quattrocento, but his activity in Siena is very hard to document. His impact on the development of the arts and architecture in his native city is also hard to assess, although this issue is especially important in the area of architectural activity in Siena at the turn of the century. Beccafumi's eccentric genius continues to attract some scholarly attention, but that interest has focused largely on his relationship to artistic trends that developed outside of Siena, in Rome and Florence. In early Cinquecento, as with Francesco di Giorgio, it is still difficult to assess Beccafuma's place within the development of Sienese painting, although recent work has attempted just that. The case of the New York exhibition is more curious. The catalog's introductory essays, Karl Strahich's Art and Culture and Renaissance Siena in particular, posed clearly and concisely many of the contextual questions of interest in this volume. And the entries on the individual works of art on display provided a wealth of information relevant to issues beyond attributions and stylistic debts. However, there seems to have been little additional interest in the decade after the show in the painters of Sienese Quattrocento, many of whom, like Sassetta, Vicetto, Matteo di Giovanni, Norocchio, and Signora, were superb masters of their art in its approach to the material. The New York show and its catalog highlighted many of the issues: public and private patronage, the fashioning of civic and personal identities, and workshop practices, to name but a few examples that are coming to define Sienese Renaissance studies. Yet it also underscored some continuing problems that face scholars interested in Sienese Renaissance art. Perhaps most striking was its underlying approach to the material covered. The artists were created monographically, which was perhaps unavoidable in the context of a museum exhibition. But in most every case, the most important issues seem to have been the individual painter's relationship to the great artistic traditions of the Trecento and Siena, as well as the degree to which he was able and willing to assimilate the modern style of Florentine. In his introductory essay to the catalog, Keith Christensen defined the problem of Sienese painting in the Quattrocento as the conflict between the new style of Florence and the cultural conservatism fostered by the glories of the past, and the fine line but the best artist of Siena walked between these two. He suggested, for example, that it cannot have been easy growing up nursing artistic ambitions in Siena in the first quarter of the 15th century. Look where one night the Monuments of a past glorious age were everywhere in evidence. And there's a huge glare. Later, that the miracle of the 15th century Sienese painting is that artists were able to turn this rich heritage to account. And then, when discussing Sassetta's career, he remarked, "Work demonstrates that it was possible for an artist to be both modern and Sienese. Sienese resistance to Renaissance style was not definitely overcome until Pius II, Sienese by birth and affection, came to the papal throne in 1458, thus initiating a wave of humanistic patronage that was more sympathetic to the developments in contemporary Florentine art and swept up Sienese artists of the second half of the Quattrocento. Christensen thus assumes that Sienese art is still to be judged by Florentine standards before 1460. It is delightful, appealing, and non-Gothic, but yet not yet Renaissance. After 1460, it is finally in line with the Renaissance, although perhaps more formally than intellectually, in an unintended irony that characterizes and often hinders much of the Sienese studies. The New York exhibition defined itself as about Renaissance Siena, while its catalog suggested, in fact, that although something happened in Siena in the 15th century, it was not strictly the Renaissance. Much of the scholarship on Sienese culture during the 15th and 16th centuries has been hampered by the lack of any profound sense of localized historical context in which to understand artists, patrons, and the works produced by and for them. It has already been noted that this situation has begun to change, although the majority of even recent work has focused more on politics and political institutions than on social and cultural topics. Historians are only beginning to define the cultural dialogue within Renaissance Siena and between that city, and the rest of Italy, including Florence. This provides the unique opportunity to see works of arts and architecture play a more central role in shaping inquiries into Renaissance Siena, and to view them not just as reflections of social, political, and economic forces in a well-defined historical matrix, but also as participants in the interactions among all factors that lie at the root of any culture. In this way, it is possible to begin to tackle the issues of conservatism and in the arts during the Quattrocento and of the simultaneous embracing of a classicizing visual vocabulary. The dynamic emerging in the current work on Renaissance Siena is therefore one that requires collaboration between historians and art historians. Indeed, the work of one seems almost impossible without the other. To take one example, tackled in Matthias Quast's essay in this volume, one cannot really understand the surprising diversity in styles among the 15th century palace facades in Siena without also knowing something about the families who had them built. It is necessary to know about their economic and social status, their political affiliations and activities, and their ties to those who held the balance of power in the city. At the same time, these buildings themselves are important documents that point to the differences separating families who might otherwise appear to share common backgrounds and interests. The diverse facade types are still there to be seen. The issue is what and how to learn from them. The same is true of the issue workshop collaboration, a phenomenon that has been seen as particularly Sienese, but is likely not a point Benjamin David elucidates in his contribution to this volume. The relationship between the works and architecture and the culture that produced them is always complex and a field still working to define itself, though the balance between the one that can observe and what one might say about it is a delicate one. Renaissance Siena art in context, the parts of the whole. The essays presented in this volume discuss an array of topics in the history of Renaissance art, architecture, and urbanism in Siena. All of them considered in their specifically Sienese context, they encompass the issues that concern a broader understanding of the city and its socio-political and cultural dynamics, and they also make thoughtful use of recent work being done in other areas of Sienese Renaissance studies. Perhaps then the most striking feature of these articles as a whole is their insistence on the Siena-ness of the situations, problems, and solutions but they examine. By framing questions and looking for answers in a local context, these essays take an important step towards a more nuanced understanding of the Sienese Renaissance. Their larger relevance comes not in the specific and important issues they illuminate, but in the definition they give to the emerging field of inquiry they are helping to shape. This collection of articles also underscores the close relationship between the study of Sienese Renaissance art and the trends that have been observed in the historical work now being done on the same period. The 15th century was one of the crises as the city struggled, particularly during the second half of the century, to find some sort of internal stability and at the same time to respond to the rapidly changing challenges from external forces beyond its control. Many of the issues that have come to be most interesting to art historians are related to these political developments, and thus problems like the fashioning of civic identity in the visual arts are front and center. In her essay, Judith Steinhardt discusses early Renaissance examples of publicly commissioned images of Siena. She relates them to similar representations of cities elsewhere in Italy, and then elucidates how Sienese thought it's best. This is the end of the excerpt, so I guess it's missing the rest. But this will be the end of this Lawrence Jenkens Introduction Renaissance Siena of the State Research. Thank you.